So let's begin by, as every presentation of research should, in my opinion, by explaining a little bit about where we are and what we're talking about, in case anybody has any doubts. So let's get straight into the small things. In almost every country of the world, we have, alongside established schooling and universities, we have vocational pathways with a work-oriented curriculum. Sometimes that involves study in the workplace or learning in the workplace. Sometimes we like to say that there are pedagogies that relate to those pathways. And increasingly, these are pathways that not only national but international governments advocate as ways by which nations of the world can achieve economic growth, can move their countries forward to the bright and sunlit uplands of bigger economies. A lot of people on these pathways, folks, around the world. 48% of upper secondary students in Europe, and increasingly we have parts of higher education or parts of tertiary education, depending on how you want to measure these things. And you might argue that vocational pathways claim both to offer access to higher education and to be part of higher education too. Okay. Now, at the same time, there's another salient feature of these pathways, and it's this. These are also pathways on which working class young people, and sometimes adults, are more strongly represented than they are on general education pathways. You might think that's obvious. Actually, it's not. There's no particular reason why, even on our policy, which proclaims that these really important segments should recruit to its ranks those young people who are less successful academically. It enables policymakers to say that they're doing their bit for inclusion, but it also means that they reproduce society's inequalities. And as Matthias Nieland eloquently puts it, they extract working class students and socialize them for working class dogs. Now, let's explain a bit about what's happening now you've digested that bit. We have certain requirements at the University of Derby. Okay, for these inaugural lectures, it has to be a public lecture addressing a non-specialist audience. And not all of you, the Vice-Chancellor may or may not consider herself to be a specialist or expert in this particular field. I think it's okay. They're supposed to be a specialist exposition of research findings. And at the same time, you've got to tell a bit of a personal story about your heroic achievements as a researcher. My goodness, and you've got to do all that in 45 or 50 minutes or so. So there's quite a lot. Now, I'd like to be able to give you a plan and say, I'm going to do these things 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to do all of them, okay? But they can't really be unpicked. So you'll get a bit of all of these things. What that's about, why our attempts to bring it together with other educational pathways fail. We're going to look at a bit of history, obviously starting at the present because we're in it and going backwards. And then we're going to ask this final question about, is a more meaningful relationship between education and work possible? Now, look, here's a field of study that most of you will have some kind of knowledge of, but you don't always understand. You're not always familiar with the methods that it uses to make sense of all these different countries in the world. Some of you have seen these photos before. Okay, we paid a graphic designer 100 quid for each of them, I think, with some money out of the Vice-Chancellor's idea spun in 2018. We've been rolling them out a lot, getting our money's worth. Okay, across different countries in Europe, we have models that have different balances between education and work. We talk about these with the transition systems of those countries. There are different philosophical traditions across those countries that inform them. And often we talk about this as an institution not so much vet scholars as political science scholars, talk about these as talk about skills formation as an institution. The people who the EU likes to call it social partners, and the way they have contended for control over it. So research in that field, there's a little neat description of it on the rights there. Some of this is about education. Some of it is a bit less about education and a bit more about the world of work. So because I've only got a few minutes to talk to you tonight, a lot of this is going to be UK focused, so apologies to international colleagues who are joining us. But this is what we've had in the UK, or what the UK government has prescribed for England, in particular since 2010. Post-16 education has become bigger in UK government policy. It's been at the top of some of the major statements of where the country will go next. It's got a stronger orientation to work. The Cavill report isn't really part of so much of the government discourse on this, but it's got this great title. It's all about work. And the technical education of Conservative-led governments, according to the House of Commons Select Committee, we paid £1 billion on making it happen. Later, I've got some data about how many people that £1 billion went on. And yet, at the same time, we've had a process where further education institutions have been blamed for all of the difficulties of young people's transitions into work. And we've actually had a reduction in the funding of further education in England. And yet, at the same time, this policy has positioned further education, or technical education, I would say, as an alternative to higher education, or as a route into, or as a hybridized form with. It's a bigger picture then than simply about further education itself. Now, those series of what you might like to call assumptions, or you could call them claims, that underpin these policies, and to some degree underpin the policies of different countries, especially in Europe. The idea that VET provides inclusion only by supporting transitions to employment. Of course, that's important. That skills are the employer's prerogative. Even Buzema and Champusch are political scholars who write about the wonderful German system and how broad and all embracing it is. But they also say employers provide skills, and that's a unique contribution in Germany. They say there's much learning, although we'll talk about what's learned in a bit, should take possible in work as possible. And that procedural knowledge, the kind of powerful knowledge that some of my colleagues like to talk about, should only happen when it's justified by the occupation. That failures, and I've already said, can be blamed on institutions. That's all there in the government skills plan from 2016. They're all the assumptions. They're all the things that we're led to believe are the most important. All this other stuff that you might think was important to young people's education, the crises facing the world, war, climate crisis, the rise of populism, that they're all incidental. And as long as we concentrate on getting jobs, that's all right. We know that these pathways are a bit gendered. Certain genders do, study for one occupation. Well, that's how the labour market works. Here's the thing. The pathways on which young people study don't just determine what jobs they go into. They affect the whole of their life chances. They affect the length of their lives. They affect their health. They affect a whole number of other things that are more significant than them simply getting a job. So, is that a skills revolution? And I'm not going to read those figures out, but you can see how many people have taken part in the government's T-levels. 8 years on, we've had 3,500 T-level students, of whom 3/4 have gone on to higher levels. We had a problematic route into it. Bless me, 15% of the people doing the the T-level foundation year, they now call it. 15% pass the first out of the first cohort, and 8% out of the second. These people on a maze go round, as the college principal described it to me, trying to get particularly English and maths qualifications, and not getting the grips with the possibilities of their vocational areas. Now, what's this about? Is it a kind of discursive alternative that policymakers use to present an alternative to investment in schools and universities? Or is it about the creation of an alternative form? And at one point, I toyed with this idea. We talk a lot about universities as institutions, maybe about colleges as institutions. Is it possible that this is about a technique, something that's described by scholars as layering? We create something new, and it changes the nature of everything that's there. Actually, I decided it wasn't. It's about something else. Let's just have a look at the data from some earlier studies. So I was involved, a couple of other colleagues here too, in an evaluation the DFE conducted into trial work placements on the T levels, and I co-wrote this report. And these are simple statements about what was going on. The preparation program offered by the National Support Organisation, it's no secret, they got the National Citizenship Scheme people the challenge to design these placements. They focused on employment preparation, employability skills and attributes. This kind of thing's still going on late. You can see it in the bottom quote as well from a study that Liz Atkins and I did. People still saying the same things. We do mock interviews. We've got CV writing, letter writing. What do I expect? What does work look like? What does work look like? Attitudes, behaviours, things like that. 12-week course. Now, isn't this one of the major problems behind this policy? And anyone I know who's listening tonight who works in further education college will have heard me hold forth about this. What happens is that we tell young people how to turn up on time if they're on a work placement, how not to let the college down, make sure you're wearing the proper clothing. Don't swear, don't spit, bring the proper clothing, bring your lunch with you, do everything you need to do to go work. The trouble is, most of these students, they have part-time jobs already. They're only in college 3 days a week. They know how to go to work. What we don't tell them is how to learn work. We don't tell them what questions to ask. We don't tell them who to talk to. We don't tell them to think about how they can relate what they're learning at work to what they're studying in college. And I see some of this has attracted a bit of government attention this week. That's exactly what we found in this study. This is still on the gov.uk website, I may say, so it must be true 6 years later. Some employers needed learners to come with technical skills. They expect this. People in childcare to know a bit about it. And how literacy skills are treated and why learners who know how to use their polycultural equipment. They want students who've learned this stuff. And the whole business about learning to work indeed should be about how to learn these skills, apply them in action. Of course, there are social dimensions to it, about learning to work with others. But the truth is that in good old neoliberal Britain, the expectation is that we send people to work to learn to behave. We send them to learn how to work. So what on earth is this about? Well, here's Professor Wolf. You've already seen a picture once, okay? Professor Baroness Wolf, and this is about a session she did a year or so back on a night I was doing a thing at Manchester Met. Government's overseeing the destruction of long-established and once effective vocational education systems. Isn't this terrible? And she had a bit of a thing about, countries shouldn't be investing in universities. They should invest in vocational education, which, of course, she's made a big contribution to policy in that area. I couldn't help noticing that it poses this as a low-cost alternative to university degrees, with implications for the whole of the system. But I also noticed that it kind of differentiates Baroness Wolfe herself. Alison Wolfe is the Sir Roy Griffiths Professor of Public Sector Management, sits across bench here. This is higher ed. This could be your post-16 or post-18 education. Don't get to thinking it's mine. And actually, that's a bit of a pattern that we have for vocational higher education office generally. I'm going to come back to this. But the way that policy has proposed this is a complicated diagram drawn by the DFE, but I think Lord Sainsbury drew the original. We suggest that you can go down any of these pathways and you can relatively unproblematically cross from one to the other with a bit of purple. See that purple box bridging provision? So you start out doing your transition year. Hopefully you'll be one of the 8% that pass. Okay. And, you might decide that you want to go into higher education. And you might decide you want to do an undergraduate degree. And if you can design some bridging provision, I've got to say, I got that job from the Gatsby Foundation of designing bridging provision. And, I came back with the best I could. They haven't done much with it because it's enormously problematic. These routes have a different rationale. But I have a bigger question, and it's this. Are these routes about improving access, or are they, as Stephen and Jerome Caraval said nearly 40 years ago in the United States, are they a diversion? Are they a way of saying to people, you don't need to go to university. You don't need the complexities of higher levels of studying. Do something else. And do you know what? All these things have a different title. Every time we've introduced vocational higher education qualifications, in the US too, and associate degrees are an American thing. I think the Canadian thing too, aren't they? But in the UK, we've got a long list of this. And by the way, every time policymakers come out of these ideas, they've invented something new. So now we've got higher education qualifications, the HEQs, because no one had heard of the other things before that we had before. But if you go back, that's foundation degrees from 2000. Before that, we had CNAA degrees because the polytechnics weren't allowed to award their own degrees for quite a long time. The colleges of advanced technology, places like Bath and Loughborough, they had all diplomas of technology. In the end, they got degrees. Then we had the Higher National Certificate. This has been going for 100 years. But they conveniently label these people as something different. You know what HND stands for, don't you? Has no degree. Okay? But actually, that wasn't a new invention. But before that, the University of London was allowing degrees to college applicants that had to sit the exams as long ago as 1873. But they're called external degrees. Do you see the pattern? So we set these things up, but then we have this kind of discourse of delineation. Okay. So that is kind of irony of these people we call technical elites in this book. Is this about playing to the strengths of these institutions, or is this about submitting to the hierarchy? And in this study, I listened to these guys, course leaders, telling me all about how many people had doctorates and how many people had master's degrees and what great academics they were. I'm doing an interview with these guys doing an HNC in construction, and so I said, this guy told me he's doing a dissertation, one of several Okay? They do a dissertation every year. I was just when they get to the end of it, I said, I mean, his was in a specialist kind of cutting edge system in building. I won't go into the details. I said, well, you must know a lot about that because, you know, you're in the industry, you're on a lot of high level projects. And he said, well, he said, you know, you learn a lot because the amount of research you do. Well, I was having one. I said, yeah, a lot of reading, great. I said, what about research in industries? One of our lecturers, he's an expert, you know, it's quite a useful person to speak. And you learn from there. Well, you're doing this upside down. Instead of building on advanced expertise in the field, you're prostrating yourselves before the trappings of higher education, and you're disengaging from the higher level learning opportunities. Well, now somebody in this room, I said, well, what do we call these people? The technical elites. They may be our more advantaged pathway compared to people who are heading for a career in childcare, but this isn't anything elite. No, it's meant ironically. Okay? Long ago, Pierre Navier, the sociologist, surrealist, and a few different things, he talks about the technical elites, something. He said, the technical elites, these people with all this managerial expertise, technical expertise emerging now, they'll never replace the consecrated elites, the people whose advantages are inherited from birth. Education is a way that these people maintain their advantages. Okay. So, how should we respond to these difficulties? Well, a lot of people in education like to differentiate between vocational and general education in terms of the principles that guide it and suggest that they should change. The philosopher Wilf Carr talked about, and I quote this quite a bit, talked about a general education and a vocational education paradigm. One's democratic, egalitarian, so that participation and collaboration are wise, technocratic and meritocratic, guided by economic needs and enterprise. And in a sense, he's right. For many researchers, the hope for vocational education and training is to draw closer to this liberal ideal. And people like Richard Cream, great David Ralph, talk about trying to find a mid-ground between liberal and about a liberal vocational education. Here's the biggest problem with all this. For many young people who have already been rejected by conventional schooling, or they've rejected it, whichever way round you want to describe it, but as we were talking about earlier this week, England is now up to nearly 1 in 20 students being suspended. It's 4% at the moment, 3% last year at this rate, and there'll be more people out than in. For many of the people who've been rejected by conventional schooling, they value the opportunity to be in something that ascribes to them a meaningful life and identity. The problem is that the vocational paradigm we have, well, how does it respond to all the social issues that we've talked about permanently? Are we getting rid of it? Or do we need to find some way of emancipating that root? Okay. And so the response of a lot of educational theory, just want to a little bit of time. Okay, the response of a lot of educational theory is actually to kind of neglect that a bit, to think of it as something that's not worthy of attention. It's not really something for us to write about. There's a revival in interest in reproduction. Altus's translation, finally out in 2014. There's people like David Battle writing about this work. But very few of these writers on reproduction who have the ability to explain in great depth the reason that young people are drawn into these pathways and the way it affects their later lives. They don't write about it. It's like a Greek tragedy, you know? For those of you who don't know, the accent is always off stage. Okay? Somebody comes on and says to another person in the room, you know, my son's eyes have been cut out. My mother's been strangled. Okay? My daughter has been enrolled on the BTEC National in health and social care. We never actually see the scene of the action. So to a certain extent, the sociology of education in particular has neglected some of these understandings. I hesitate to go into too much depth about this, but where mid-range theory is quite dominant in our field, where people tend to discuss educational institutions or sectors as institutions, or still formation as institutions. It suggests a certain degree of agency for the people who work there. It suggests an autonomy from, as I sort of say, the economic foundations, and it suggests that they can somehow rise above the fray, or we should think of these things as an independent way opposed to the economic structures of life. But I just find that quite problematic. I find it problematic when people talk in a Bourdieusian sense about a field in which there are actors who are relatively autonomous. The external pole, perhaps heteronomy, as Bourdieu had said, the economic field is big in the vocational sphere. How could it not be? And so that makes it problematic for us to theorize the future of that in quite the same way. And to theorize where it sits in relation to higher education. Now, there's an international discussion about what the Germans in particular, I've got to say, like to talk about the quite kind about permeability. And here we are talking about it in China, to a conference that Germans and Chinese colleagues about permeability. Is it the possibility for young people to make transitions from vocational to more traditional higher education institutions, or is it about the creation of institutions? And then when we create those institutions, are we adding to the degree of stratification, both in the higher education sector and actually in that as well? Now, we've been having these debates for a while. You know, we can go back to Martin Troll, who first wrote about mass higher education. Well, the Americans, you know, I said nearly every country has a vocational pathway. The Americans don't, okay? Everything's higher education to the Americans. It's just there are certain routes that don't take you into professional jobs. So he talked about that's the movement to mass and universal higher education as we start to recruit non-traditional students. We've got a new institutional type, the junior college or community college, as we usually say nowadays. So there's all these high participation systems are multiplying the inequalities within that system. And here's the problem. The people who are in the top layer of those stratified systems, the elite universities, are the people who define what is of value. You know, Trevor Gale's written about this quite recently, where he draws on Bourdieu's work on the cultural sphere. He says the same people who define what is a taste are the people who are producing the tasteful products. And in this case, it's the people in the oldest universities. They're the people who determine what's good. And everybody else feels an obligation to go along with that. Something that I think we need to move away from. Great. So how do we make sense there of this kind of stratification? This slide's important. That's why lots of the bits are in that. Okay. And now we're starting our journey back in time. We're starting in the present day to try and explain what's happening. And my explanation is that we can't understand what's taking place in higher education's boundaries with that or within that without understanding how both education and work have been changed by neoliberalism. This isn't a matter of thinking about different techniques or pedagogies or the potential of learning work. All these things have their possibilities, but the idea that we're going to learn incidental learning is a popular phrase nowadays. The idea that we might learn something while we're at work, well, that's neither vocational, because it doesn't determine your ability to carry out any occupation. It's not pedagogic because there's no intentional acts of teaching and learning. Instead, we need to understand how, first of all, under neoliberalism, we have a commodification of education. We think about education as a market. And now we're going to make more education take place outside those educational institutions that try to give people a standard and a common experience. We talk about the common school. We're going to enable people to access learning opportunities through the labour market. And what that means is the people who have the right connections, who are able to get themselves the right jobs or the right placements, because of their social connections, they will be able to secure the more advantaged learning opportunities. And so all the inequalities that people have written about in relation to the way that school favours people who already have certain cultural experiences from their family background, is going to multiply that in a more unequal environment. It's happening not just because schooling is schools policies around the world are saying it's happening because we're in a more polarized world. It's polarization of income. There's polarization of wealth. There's actually polarization of skills. It's not the case that capitalism de-skills everyone. It may de-skill some people. There are also generations, there are also groups who need new skills, need more advanced skills. They're the middle layers to which high standard of education aspires to draw people, but it is not very successful yet. And the converse of that, is at the same time it creates new inequalities within vocational education. We call it these phases. We talked about the technical elites I've mentioned already. We talked about welfare vocationalism. We've been talking about it this afternoon, so apologies to those people who've been on the vet train all afternoon. I'm not going to repeat that discussion very much. My colleague Liz Atkins, my co-author Liz, likes to say that in further education, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. I was thinking, well, everything's changed. But the truth is, the bits that Liz is interested in haven't changed, because it's about the way that disadvantaged young people, especially young women, are provided with generic skills, are provided with socialization into work, are not provided with skills and knowledge that they can use in the labour markets or which enrich their lives in other ways. It takes us back to the kind of education that for the UK and for the US came in the 1980s, when we replaced more meaningful vocational programs or technical education with a genericism that was geared to the young unemployed. So further education colleges 40 plus years ago were geared towards part-time study by young people who were many young men, it has to be said. Then they became the place where the unemployed were trained or were schooled into the kind of behaviours and attitudes that will make them employable should the opportunity arise. And in many ways, we're repeating that kind of thing again. So, bit of a flashback to that. Most of the literature in our fields about this, so don't let me go on about it. But it's not only about access to powerful knowledge, which again other people have written about much more eloquently than me. It's also about the cultural dimensions of vocational learning. When we went on to this competence-based education, when everything became, can you perform these tasks and can we tick these boxes and give you a national vocational qualification, when that became the dominant mode of further education, and it's also spread throughout those institutions, we didn't only narrow the technical aspects, but we got rid of something that had been there since the 1950s, a complementary cultural element, the liberal and general studies that were provided by staff with non-technical expertise that were introduced in the 1950s. We came across all this stuff all over again when we carried out our study of enrichment over the last 4 years. What are the cultural elements? And here's the amazing thing. We studied both further education colleges. We studied sixth form colleges, which are more general education-based institutions. These cultural elements, they're alive and well in the enrichment programs of sixth form colleges. And you think they're doing something abstract? Do you think they're going to the theatre to watch Greek tragedies, for example? They're doing practical vocational things. They're science students building green cars. They're English students producing a college journal. They're putting on a performance. They're doing something practical, but they're doing it in the context of a broader education. And it has meaning, adds depth to what they do, and enables them to say something when they go along with their university interviews and want to show how cultured they are. Further education. We've got support activities. We met some fantastic people working their socks off, doing wonderful things to support those students and keep them on their course and keep them sane. We didn't see them doing things that enriched their outlook and let them think about their field more broadly. And people are still writing about all this. The discipline general studies, the Ethics Board had a couple of reports this year. We've written about it in our papers on the enrichment project. The Post-16 Educator, it was alive and well, was the magazine of the Association of Liberal Studies and the Liberal Studies section of the College Lecturers Union. It's still going, and it's just published an archive of all its issues going back to 1988. A great research opportunity for somebody. And where it had been recommended these things to be integrated in the mainstream, that never happened, okay, in the MBQ model curriculum. Okay. But is that the course of bygone age? What are the technical, what's this technical education language about? First, when I left school, it wasn't called technical education anymore. They weren't called technical colleges anymore. In the course and even further bygone age, got a few family things that came into possession after my parents died. What a revelation some of them were. And for them, by most male skilled workers, their learning took place at work. The lucky ones got to attend evening institutes. And until the 1890s, even that had very, very weak institutional foundations. Local authorities met the resistance of employers who didn't want institutions that will give away the secrets, their trade secrets, and teach people who didn't work for them how to do the jobs their workers had in case they wanted to do those jobs for somebody else. Only with the foundations of the welfare state do we start to move on from that. But, here's an uncle's record of his learning. These are just the machines he worked on. And over 4 years, there's his apprenticeship papers in the corner. Cost his parents £5. He got 5 old pence an hour, working as an apprentice. And, most of the time their learning took place in the not very congenial circumstances. That's my great granddad at Morris Cranes. And there's another relative of Morris Cranes. Well, it's a bit dirty. But nonetheless, he did something for them. And it extended. And it started at the lowest levels. And he went to the highest levels. And where we had the early polytechnics, not the ones that have now become universities today, although some of them are, but the polytechnics we had at the end of the 19th century that the London Education Board supported, they went up to degree level. Again, there was tremendous resistance, and they were tiny. And they gave access to education for a tiny number of people. And I don't want to overstate it. Look, this is a letter signed by Herbert Schofield. Anybody from Loughborough University will recognise that name? This guy who's the pioneer of Loughborough College, then Loughborough College Advanced Technology, and then Loughborough University. When he started work, he was one of 2 full-time employees at the college. When he wrote that letter, he'd been there 2 years. It was relatively tiny. And here's the more remarkable thing, or here's the thing that echoes with me. There were few options, even for boys. They were constrained by culture. When my dad died, when my mother died, and I inherited all his educational documents, because, they hoard these things for a century or so, I see, notwithstanding his 11 plus, he had to go to the board school. There's a story. And he had to study these handicrafts, machine drawing. If you look at his results, he wasn't very good at those things. He was pretty good at English, wasn't he? English language, English literature. He was taught to the class. French, he was taught to the class. I never heard him speak a word of French in his life. It's not that kind of French. But for young people like him, it was unthinkable that they would be able to build on that kind of knowledge and that kind of orientation. And so he went off to study his high nationals in the 1950s. I read what the pass rate was in a thesis, because it was quite hard. They had to bring in 1-year qualifications for managers, because anybody like to guess the pass rate? You had to do the whole of the ordinary national diploma and then the highest, so 5 years. Well, and like to speculate on the pass rate, your field. By coincidence, it was 8%. Okay? That comes up a lot in this lecture. That's the only valid route for people of that kind. So it's a bit narrow. Really, for the whole of the history of learning for work, there's only really one brief period from 1964 where you could say we had social partnership on the lines that are favoured by the European Union. And why? And for a long time, employers, far from the people who are making this happen, have been the people who've not been doing a great job, putting it mildly, have been people who've resisted this. Now, somebody said to me, why is this about half education and forgotten half? It's half, because it's half the 16-year-olds. Is it about a door knows how to build on? I think what was in my mind was this: half-time education. Okay, we used to have this thing before we had universal schooling. You could go to school on the employer's premises. Okay, so you would work for 10 hours and then go to school. It's called half-time education. And the great thing is, if you did behave in the workplace, you could be punished for it in school. It's quite convenient. Harold Silver, who wrote the history of the CNAA, wrote a chapter about this. And a lot of his data is drawn from documents, in particular the Newcastle Commission, which is full of accounts of young people describing how exhausted they were when they went into school after they'd been working all day and they could barely keep their eyes open. They hadn't eaten properly, and quite moving stories. The same Newcastle Commission reports, I'd already read them. They're all in capital, okay? And the reason they're in capital is because Marx, he had a chapter about relative surplus value. That's about how the capitalists make more profits by increasing productivity, okay? But there's also a chapter about absolute surplus value. That's how you make more profit, more surplus value, by extending the working day. And so it's full of all these moving accounts of the suffering of working people from the mid-19th century. A lot of them were taken from these accounts of the schooling of the day. You've heard the slogan, I think, earn while you learn, okay? Did we quite finish on that slide? Yeah, that did. I guess we have to go back to the during this time, because I don't want to oversimplify this and make out that that this is just about a struggle between capital and labor, and these are just two models of that kind. These models of learning are infinitely older. It's the truth of the matter. They date back millennia. We've had a form of schooling that involves the manipulation of symbols, that involves abstraction. As long as we've had administrative power, people who advise administrators, sometimes from a religious perspective, we've had that kind of formal education for thousands of years. And then we've had the skills of teachers, people with these specialties. The learning is more informal. They're intimately connected with places, materials, senses, tools. But they're uncoded. They're uncodified. And yes, and I mentioned Michael Coolidge is one of the people in the field of archaeology who writes about this best, because from understanding the products, they then look at the wholes, they then try to extract an understanding of the whole society. They talk about the fine repertoire, the chain from the mining of stone or whatever raw materials and its eventual consumption. And from that, they deduce the existence of systems of apprenticeship. It's been around a long time. And I think those two models both live on. And they both have their merits. And they can contribute something to people's aspirations to know the world better and to create a better future. But also they can contribute something to the desires of those people who don't want to spread that about too much. So, this is a rather crude slide. I was going to put it at the start, but I thought I should set the tone a little better. So, here's me strapping my head outside on and asking myself, can we reframe the skills debate that we've been having for 10 years? I'll roll this picture out. This is Philip Hammond announcing the money for the T-levels. No one ever said it was going to cost 10 million. 10 million, a billion. And I think there might be David Gort behind him. He said, we need to get that money back by squeezing it out of education elsewhere. Yes, we've gone from learning about work to learning for work to learning at work to learning is work. But how can we think about ways to connect education and work differently? So I've not come here to say the vocational education is a terrible thing. I hope I've given a vision of both sides of it and its positives, as well as some of the problematic aspects of it. Let's come back to Wilf Carr and those paradigms he talked about. He also asked the question, or he also makes the suggestion. He said, well, what if you can employ the discourse of general education to talk about vocational subjects? And you should say there are always opportunities for reflective understanding, critically examining the values and cultures of work and what industries are for. What are we doing? What are the things there? What are the ethical implications? What real difference do they make to the lives of the people who work in them and in the communities that are affected by them? How are they affecting the future possibilities of the planet? We might add nowadays. You can look at vocational education in that way. We found a bit of it in our project on an election. Or you can employ the discourse of vocationalism to assume that we teach them education in ways that emphasize its market value and, yes, folks, how to get a job. Is getting a job important? My goodness, of course it is. But here's my suggestion. Forget all this stuff. I'm sure you've seen about David Graeber's bullshit jobs. I know, this tends to diminish the value of modern day work. Yes, I'm sure there are some jobs that are a bit of a waste of time. I'm sure they don't apply to anybody here. And I'm sure they don't apply to many of the millions of people David Graeber thinks it applies to. These colleagues, Couture and Perez, have written a book, I think came out last year in France, Giving Back the Meaning to Work. So why can't we have a vocational education and work that are education? Why don't you stop trying to make schools and colleges look like the workplace and start trying to make work look like a place of genuine, meaningful learning? Now, God bless the press office who were kind enough to come and talk to me and try and find out what this was about. It's a very interesting discussion. And they said, well, can you tell us where you found that you think's great? Scratched my head a bit. But I was in Valencia last month. It was very sunny there at a conference. And I came across this plaque. It's one of the plaques that they have around the town commemorating things that happened in the Civil War in the 1930s. And on one of the main streets, there's what was a place of training Jesuit priests that they took over during the Civil War. And in a country where literacy was less than 50%, they set up this institute for workers' children, and according to who you believe, they were doing 2-year degrees, or they were doing degrees in 2 years, or they were doing baccalaureates, so that's going on at degree level. A really intensive program. Forget all that Bathmaker stuff. I don't know how Marie said it. I mean, that the way Bathmaker reports people talking about vocationalism as an easy option. These people had a program that went into the evening. They lived side by side with their tutors. Their tutors were some of the most noted academics in Spain. Around the side of this poster, there are some pictures taken by Otto Reuter. And you can see in the canteen with these academics, they had a mixed curriculum and a really intensive pedagogy. We might say, was this just a propaganda vehicle? Just something they were doing during the war? Well, just point you can. There's a little poster from the time that I found online. The Ministry of Public Instruction has created a Workers' Institute. Workers and their children can become engineers, doctors, architects. The Popular Front government opens the doors to higher education. Defend your children's education while sliding fascism to the death. Okay. There they are in the library. At the end of it, nobody graduated. It took place during the Civil War, which ended with a 40-year dictatorship, which was dedicated to putting education back in the hands of the church, to getting rid of the popular pedagogy around the so-called modern school, the battles that have taken place in that country, building informal education where the state didn't provide it. All those things were destroyed, and we had a 40-year dictatorship from which we emerged with literacy not much higher than 50%. We can only really, guys in Spain say, talk about the universal education from the 1990s, in which that played a considerable role. And only in the 1980s, after 50 years, did the people who attended this experiment, people started to get hold of them, collect data, gather their accounts. And they understood, they said. They understood that it wasn't possible for them to graduate. And it's been a very bitter period for many people. And we should have a sense of proportion. It's easy to look in the newspapers and read about Donald Trump sweeping away the Department for Education, to read about some of the neoliberal reforms taking place in other countries. And I wonder what the future of education really is. Well, let's have a sense of proportion. These people suffered a serious defeat and a real setback that affected the whole of their lives. Many of them, for their own reasons, suffered serious depression or exile during that period. But themselves, or some of them said in these interviews, they understood that the education that they had the potential to be the education of the future. So that's incredibly powerful. And you may think of all the struggles that are taking place. Why talk about something from so many years ago? And the reason it has an echo with me is because those ideas lived on in those people for 50 years. They understood the possibility that we could construct an education without a hierarchy that enables people to find meaningful work, to have meaningful and fulfilling working lives, and contributes to a richer society, to a more just society, and to sustainable planets. And that there are lots of kind of passion references to moments if I've got to talk about. I'm still waiting for to hold me up the 15-minute note. But maybe I'm sincere. Anyway. But I hope that's what's motivated my work too. And for those younger researchers many of them have been with us all afternoon talking about these things, I hope that'll continue to motivate you too in your research careers from now on.